Good day, everyone. My name is Father Jim Loughran, and I'm delighted to invite you all to Paths of Peace to Heal Open Wounds, Interreligious Encounters with Fratelli Tutti, the encyclical that was signed and released by Pope Francis this past year on October 4th, 2020, which is the Catholic celebration of the feast of St. Francis of Assisi. Fratelli Tutti, all of us are brothers and sisters, an attempt to try to get us to understand more clearly the interconnections between every human being everywhere. In spite of all the divergence we have in our world, we are truly called to be supportive of one another. And so we're very happy that you could join us today with our distinguished panel. Graymoor Ecumenical and Interreligious Institute is based in New York City at the Interchurch Center. It's our pleasure to present this program today with our co-sponsors, the Interfaith Center of New York, the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue, Religions for Peace USA, and the Thich Nhat Hanh Program for Engaged Buddhism. This program is coincidentally taking place the day before the first observance of the UN International Day of Human Fraternity. That's going to be commemorated tomorrow. And it has received great support from Pope Francis in Rome. So we're very happy that we could have this discussion today with a distinguished panel. I would like to turn it over now to our moderator, Father Brian Terry, the Minister General of the Franciscan Friars of the Atonement.
Well, good day to all. I know everyone's in a different time zone, so some of us are in the snow in New York and some of us are in Glasgow. We have a really distinguished panel with us here today. We're very excited to be here and to share this time with you. I was asked a very interesting question. When we've been talking about this before, some people that don't understand how all of the bits and pieces of the Catholic Church works, they simply asked a very simple question: what's an encyclical and where does it come from? So we thought perhaps maybe just a beginning note would be to say, it's kind of hard to explain the whole ecclesiology of the Catholic Church, but if you imagine that the whole world is divided up into different dioceses, the way that the Catholic Church looks is the world. There's all these different places, and in each place there's a bishop. The highest role that you can have or title you can have in the church is actually bishop. So the Pope, who is the author of this encyclical, his biggest title is the Bishop of Rome, but he has honorary titles as a cardinal and as the primate, the Pope, the first. And so the Pope calls around him cardinals. They are to be people who are, the word cardinal means hinges. They are to be hinges on the world for him to have a perspective about the world, and they work in consultation with him. They are his counsel. He gets together with them, other theologians, and they have discernment sessions where they decide what is an important issue for the world to look at. And basically encyclicals are sent directly to the bishops as a way of being provocative, making all of us think. It's also disseminated to the faithful so that they also can have information about what the Pope is thinking is a direction, things in peace and justice that we need to be turning our attention to. So it's leading a coordinated reflection. So this encyclical today that we're addressing, Fratelli Tutti, has a base in a long project. Pope Francis has called for a series of encounters of different people of different faiths and different traditions all across the world. And as they've come together, for example, for Laudato Si, the document that had come before this, over 14,000 people met all over the world to have small group meetings. They called them synods. So there would be a synodal concept of getting together, talking about different subjects, and then passing that on up to the Pope about what is going on. One of the big things was important for him was that we are talking about the fact that we are all brothers and sisters, but it wasn't to be a document just studied. It was to be doing what we're doing today. We are living out Fratelli Tutti as we're trying to listen with open hearts to one another about some of the topics that he has addressed in this document. So with that, the document is comprehensive. It's a large document over 90 pages and has a lot of different things for us to treat. So we're simply asking each one of us as we're here today, what is it that opens your heart or something you want to know more about? And things that we can talk about together as brothers and sisters, one and all. So as we begin, we'll have 4 of our speakers talk, and then we'll break up into small chat rooms for each one of us to further the conversation. Because what this is about is encounter. Pope Francis asked us to look at the culture of encounter we have and how authentic is it. And today we would like to say, let's do it today, not just talk about it. So I would like to introduce our very first speaker who will share with us his perspective, Rabbi Burton Witzowski, who serves as the Appleman Professor of Midrash and Interreligious Studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. So I'd like to turn it over to you now, Bert. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this, I would say convivium, except that we're not eating and drinking together, but let's call it a colloquium, where we will engage in colloquy. I want to start a little bit by listing my bona fides, and I'm doing that particularly about my relations with the Catholic Church, because in a couple of minutes, I'm going to kvetch about Fratelli Tutti. But before I do that, let me begin by welcoming this document. We are at a time of extreme partisanship. Everybody's dividing up against each other. You can be red, you can be blue, at least in the United States of America, but it seems hard to be purple. You can be Jew versus whomever, and God knows for 2,000 years, Jews in the church were not friendly with one another. And I celebrate, truly celebrate, that for the last 55 years, since the Second Vatican Council promulgated a document called Nostra Aetate, in our time, the relationship between the church and the synagogue has gone from being one of enemies to actually being one of not just friends, but friends working together to address the world's ills. A good example of that is what you mentioned, Laudato Si. That previous encyclical of the Pope is very welcome. Our world is desperately in need of saving, and the only way we're going to be able to do that is together. At the Pope's invitation, I was engaged in a Jewish, Christian, Muslim dialogue at Fordham University, a Jesuit university, in New York City, where we studied together Laudato Si, and then, having studied together and acted together on a variety of environmental issues, we sent a couple of delegates to Rome to meet with the Pope so that he would know that we took seriously the dictates of Laudato Si. I am looking forward to doing the same, God willing, Dio Volente, as you would say, for Fratelli Tutti. Brian, I want to ask you, if I want to say it in it full, is it Fratelli e Sorelli Tutti? Is that the way to say it?
No, questo è un piccolo problema della lingua, fratello. This begins the cultural kind of discussion we're talking about. Of course, we know in Italian, when you say fratelli, it means brothers and sisters. The translation into the English language, which is, again, pushing the culture, does translate it brothers and sisters all. So,
Here.
Unless we have time for a pizza to get into the linguistics, yes, we'll talk about that later. But
you're correct. God willing, soon we will be able to go out and have a pizza. And I want to really welcome my sisters. I've been following Mona Siddiqui's work for many, many years now, and Pritpal, Kaur, and I were actually on a call earlier today for Religions for Peace. We sit on a committee together. So it's wonderful to do this kind of work. Gregory Snyder, of course, is right across the street from the Jewish Theological Seminary. So we are truly brothers and sisters. I have had the opportunity to work, to meet, to be engaged with Pope Francis on many, many occasions. And I want to quickly rehearse them before I critique him. In 2007, I had the opportunity to teach at the Gregorian. That was before Francis was Pope. Benedict was Pope, and I met him then. But then in 2014, I was at the Angelicum in Rome. In 2015, the Pope came to New York. In 2017, again, I met with him in Rome. In 2019, again, I met with him in Rome. And as I said, Dio Volente, God willing, next year, this time, I'll be traveling to Rome again and teaching at the Gregorian one more time. So I count myself truly blessed to have good relations with the Catholic Church. My rabbi for New Testament was the late beloved Father Raymond Brown, who was a professor at Union Seminary. And it is from him that I learned not only New Testament, but how to love my Catholic neighbors. I think on the whole, Fratelli Tutti is a very solid document. It calls us all to dialogue. It calls us to engage. Indeed, it calls us to move beyond dialogue, to work together. That said, I am a careful reader of text. That's my position as a professor of Midrash. I read text. And in reading the encyclical on paragraphs 59 and 60, which of course jump out at me because they're about Judaism, I have to say I was disappointed. I suspect Pope Francis himself did not sit down and author this, since I know that personally he has very close relations with the Jews. But these two paragraphs, to my mind, had a bit of a whiff of supersessionism. They talk about, well, Judaism looked out for itself, and the church, we learned to look out for others. And then that was exacerbated, I dare say, in paragraphs 80 and 81, when the Pope, understandably, went to a New Testament story, and that is the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, in that story, it is the priest and the Levite who overlook the suffering Samaritan, and the Christian who, of course, treats him well. And I want to say for the record that if there were a Samaritan on the streets of Manhattan suffering, I and my Jewish colleagues would be among the first to tend to them. And I think that was probably true in the time of Jesus of Nazareth as well. So again, I understand why it's there in the New Testament. I understand why it's there in its context, but I am less than pleased that it's here in Fratelli Tutti. We could have done better in embracing the Jewish community.
Thank you, Bert. We hear what you're saying and understand what you're saying. And just a little bit of a chat at the time, at the writing of that, a chat person reminded us that there weren't Christians at that time, perhaps the time of the writing of the scriptures, but not at the time of Christ. Because we all confess Christ wasn't a Christian. So,
by the way, for the record, I think Jesus of Nazareth is the first person referred to with the title rabbi.
Yes, could be, yes. Could be. So once again, thank you, Bert. And again, with open hearts, we listen to what you say this day, and we welcome you being here with us. So now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Mona Siddiqui. And she is the professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies at the University of Edinburgh and specializes in classic Islamic law and Christian-Muslim relations. So welcome this morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm not going to say anything about my background. I think people can look that up or look at the short bio. But I do have a text prepared, so I'm just going to go straight into the text. Pope Francis signed Fratelli Tutti on the 3rd of October 2020 in Assisi at the tomb of St. Francis of Assisi in the eponymous basilica after celebrating Mass in front of the tomb. He put the text of the encyclical on the altar and the tomb of St. Francis and signed it, as it's known. While the title is in Italian, as far as I know, the content is in Spanish. The spirit of humility and internationalism is already there at the outset. The encyclical is devoted to fraternity and social friendship. And early on, the Pope expresses a source of inspiration in my brother Bartholomew, the Orthodox patriarch, who has spoken forcefully of our need to care for creation. In this case, I have felt particularly encouraged by the Grand Imam Ahmed al-Tayyib, with whom I met in Abu Dhabi, where we declared that God has created all human beings equal in rights, duties, and dignities, and has called them to live together as brothers and sisters. What could be a bigger call to humankind than fraternity between all people? The dream which the encyclical calls for. But while this is a dominant and repeated call in the encyclical, the image of brothers and sisters evokes the concept of family. And we all know that our ideal of family is often removed from the reality of family. Families fight, can compete and resent, and often even in the best of them, it isn't love which binds a family, but a sense of duty. I would argue that love and compassion can inspire, but it is a sense of responsibility and duty to one another which actually delivers. The encyclical reminds me of the famous dream speech of the Reverend Martin Luther King, who also called for human dignity and equality. And yet, decades later, the world remains a hugely unequal place. And if anything, today, COVID-19 has shone a rather grim light on the huge disparities in the qualities of people's lives. Color and race remain at the center of this lack of fraternity, because racial division is still everywhere, and it creates hierarchies of dignity. That human beings are born with an inherent dignity does not mean that human beings are born with equal dignity, or even live equally dignified lives. The Pope writes, to care for the world in which we live means to care for ourselves. Yet we need to think of ourselves more and more as a single family dwelling in a common home. I think the Pope is right to say that love is not only a personal relationship, but should also be at the heart of our political decision-making. But the nation state, in reality, has carved out different homes. It has separated the rich from the poor. COVID-19 has shown us that no one is saved alone. We can only be saved together. But the moral imperative ensuring that the vaccine is distributed fairly around the world is already proving to be a challenge, because people and nations generally look after their own. Political love is usually selfish. The rich nations can always buy access and power, and through that, they can actually buy life itself. St. Francis was known for finding God in poverty, but the poor should not have to contend simply with those who walk beside them, who show compassion, because it seems to me that compassion is never enough. The poor deserve the opportunity to flourish through real help and support, which lifts them and their families to a more prosperous, even if it's a materially prosperous life. The theology of a loving God must translate into the politics of a loving God, because theology is not just about reflecting on the world, it's fundamentally about mending the world. This is why the Lucan parable of the Good Samaritan, which permeates the Christian sensibilities of the encyclical, may still have appeal today. But I think it is limited. The road from Jerusalem down to Jericho can be seen as a picture of human history. The victim is an image of Adam, of mankind in general, a person wounded and alienated. The Good Samaritan can be seen as an image of Christ himself. The oil and wine poured into his wounds are the healing gifts of sacraments. But for me, the most important aspect of the story is that the Samaritan ensures that the man is restored to health. He takes personal responsibility by taking the man to the hostel, entrusts him to the innkeeper, and most importantly, leaves money for his care. His help is sustainable and prudent help. And I say limited only because why should we still be asking the question, who is my neighbor? It is a use of this question which has often made migration such a heated debate. The separation of people into good migrants, bad migrants, people whose humanity is reduced as they are increasingly categorized as either threats or resources to a nation. The Pope also refers to the famous meeting between St. Francis of Assisi and Sultan Malik in Egypt amidst the bloody warfare of the Fifth Crusade. But the story is too often simplified as an example of a successful interreligious meeting, as the intention behind this meeting has often been called into question. It has far more resonance in Christianity than in Islam. Whatever the intention of St. Francis, it isn't religions which create peace and freedoms. It is people who commit to peace. One doesn't have an encounter with religion. One meets people whose lives may or may not be inspired by a religious faith to do the right thing, to act selflessly. And I would say that we actually have seen many examples of how people have acted charitably and selflessly in these challenging times. Things are not that bleak. Our moral life is contained in our encounters and friendships, and this is made possible by modern, diverse, and largely secular societies, which create the space and the desire for such connections. And our histories show, all of us, that religious faith doesn't have any claim on goodness or moral character. And to create a division between secularism and secularity from faith, I think, is erroneous and doesn't reflect how most people live their lives or their faiths. Personally, I count myself lucky that I've grown up in the liberal social milieu of a Western society, where I have enjoyed the freedom to resist the more rigorous conceptions of some religious groups, including Muslims, that you cannot have true friendship with those outside your faith, that a shared faith should be a defining premise of any friendship. This freedom, for me, is both a virtue and a privilege, because I know it isn't universal. I've been drawn to this, not as a fan of dialogue, but through that most complex exchange of intellectual and emotional intimacy. Dialogue is a contested word, and too often it's more about optics than substance. The word dialogue has become an umbrella term, struggling under its own weight of peacemaking. Often it's contrived, little more than symbolism, and obscures the injustices and the lack of listening we all fail to address in our own faith and communities. But the most contentious aspect of dialogue is that so often people don't approach one another in the spirit of openness, nor in the spirit of wishing to share. Neither Sunni Islam nor Catholic Christianity are one thing. They are global religions full of internal divisions around all human issues, sexuality, politics, and what even is the common good or the good life. So it's hardly surprising that so often faith groups are reluctant to realize deeper interreligious cooperation. Religious universalism doesn't overcome religious particularity, and nor should it. How can the incarnation, the finality of prophecy, or the idea of a chosen people be subsumed under the idea of a universal fatherhood of God? We need a shift in consciousness about what faith in God means in today's world, and we need a language of hospitality which rejects any kind of triumphalism, because it is hospitality which adds the sublime to the profane and keeps the sacred alive in the ordinary. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much, Mona. That was well spoken. And again, I hope we do have the courage to hear and to start this kind of, as you said, and a type of exchange. I totally agree with you on the overuse of the word dialogue. One of my favorite philosophers is Paul Ricoeur, talking about true dialogue. When we become fused and become part of one another's horizon in that great intimacy that you're calling for. So I do hope, and I dream with you, that we can be more stronger agents of dialogue. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker today, Dr. Pritpal Kaur, and she serves as the educational director at the Sikh Coalition, the nation's largest Sikh civil rights organization, and co-president of the World Council of Religions for Peace. So now I'd like to turn it over to Pritpal Kaur.
Thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts today. And at the outset, I wanted to set the context that these are my personal reflections as someone from the Sikh community, and are not representative of the views of any organization that I'm affiliated with. I was really excited to receive the invitation to participate because in 2006, on the 20th anniversary of the World Day of Prayer for Peace, I had been humbled and privileged to participate in an interreligious youth meeting in Assisi, facilitated by the Pontifical Council of Interreligious Dialogue, alongside around 100 youths from various religious traditions from throughout the world. And preparing for this event today brought back some wonderful memories of that trip, from which I learned so much about St. Francis through my encounters with others at Assisi. But fast forwarding some 14 years later, to what we're discussing today, the Sikh faith, or the Sikh Dharam, as many practitioners call it, offered me a really beautiful platform from which to explore the encyclical. And my presentation today is more a reflection from a Sikh perspective rather than a critique. Sikhs believe they are here on earth to practice two things, prayer and service. So it's really prayer and then how to put that prayer into action through selfless service. And it's these two lenses from which I've viewed the encyclical from, and from which I'd like to share some of the many parallels that I drew. And firstly, I'll share thoughts on what I would broadly categorize as grounded in Sikh teachings. And then secondly, I'll share what spoke to me as a Sikh in the calls to action. And to begin, and this may seem very obvious, but this encyclical prompted me to recall the basis of the Sikh Dharam's approach to engaging with others, which stems from the central teaching of Ik Oankar, that there is one infinite divine power, God the Creator. And from this teaching stems the notion that God is not only the creator, but is also inherent within all of his creation. There's a line in Sikh scripture, Sab mein jyot jyot hai soi, tiste chanan sab mein chanan hoy. And this means that within all living beings is the same light, the light of the divine creator, and therefore all human beings are equal, having been created by the same divine source. And it's this nuance of the teaching which I felt aligned so strongly with the call to acknowledge the dignity of each and every person. The philosophy behind the attitudes of Sikhs to other faiths is further illustrated by looking at examples from lives of the Sikh gurus. The opening of the encyclical makes reference to St. Francis's visit to Egypt, and this reminded me of Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikh Dharam, who made 4 long interfaith journeys over a period of 24 years with his childhood friends, a Muslim musician named by Mardana and a Hindu named by Bala. He went eastwards, visiting cities sacred to the Hindus, southwards towards Sri Lanka, and then returning via Gujarat and Rajasthan, and later journeyed northwards into the Himalayas as far as Tibet. He then went westwards towards the Middle East to Mecca and Medina, sacred cities of Islam, returning through Iran, Iraq, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. There are many historical accounts associated with these journeys, which through each encounter and interaction with others, there was a call for integrity and truth by teaching through practical example with humility and a love for humanity. Guru Nanak's message was one of integrity and sincerity. If you are Muslim, be a good Muslim. If you are a Hindu, be a good Hindu. It's your actions and your truthful living which you'll be held accountable for, not the label of your religion. And subsequent gurus also set examples for engaging with others. The 5th guru invited the foundation stone of the Harmandir Sahib, commonly known as the Golden Temple, to be laid by a Muslim saint. And it was also designed with 4 entrances, indicating that Sikhs welcome people from all walks of life. And the tradition of langar, free vegetarian food distributed from all gurdwaras, Sikh places of worship, is one of serving all people without discrimination. The 10th Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, asserted Manas ki jaat sab ek hi pehchanbo, which instructs us to recognize the entire human race as one family. And this to me resounded very precisely with passages that spoke to the sense of belonging to a single human family in the encyclical. But to me, the most important question raised was, how can we put this notion of a human family into practice and apply it to the problems that the world is facing today? What does it really mean to be brothers and sisters and not just neighbors? The encyclical stated that St. Francis heard the voice of God, he heard the voice of the poor, he heard the voice of the infirm, and he heard the voice of nature. He made of them a way of life. And this is really what the Sikh Dharam is about for Sikhs. It's a way of life, to live in God's presence, to walk the path of life truthfully, and to apply the values that our faith teaches us in the moments which matter the most. And this takes me to the second part of my reflection on the calls to action. And for me, there were 2 that particularly stood out. Firstly, the call to exercise love, and then the call to exercise forgiveness and reconciliation. And here again, there are many parallels which I drew from the call to exercise love. To truly treat someone as a brother or a sister means not to tolerate them and not to respect them, but to love them so dearly that we're willing to sacrifice for them. Guru Nanak has stated, Joto Prem Khilan Ka Chao Sirdar Gali Meri Ao, which means to play this game of love, then come to me with your palm in your hand, which means to rid yourself completely of your ego. The phrase in the encyclical, sacrifice is born out of love, reminded me of the sacrifice of the ninth Guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur, during a time of widespread religious oppression under the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. A group of Hindu Pandits from Kashmir approached the Guru for help. Learning of their plight, the Guru stood up to the Mughal authorities and willingly offered his life to spare the Hindu Pandits, even though he was the leader of a different religion. He resisted conversion and was subsequently beheaded. The Sikhs recall the Guru's supreme sacrifice of his life as a lesson to uphold the freedom and dignity of all people. And when I read the parable of the Good Samaritan in chapter 2, another parallel also became apparent. A water carrier named Baikanaya during the time of the 10th Guru would serve water to wounded soldiers on the battlefield. But as well as serving water to the wounded Sikh soldiers, he also gave water to the soldiers from the Mughal army on the enemy's side. And some Sikhs complained to the Guru about this, and Guru Gobind Singh asked to speak to him. And instead of berating him, as the Sikh soldiers expected, the Guru praised him and blessed him with an ointment to tend to the wounds of the injured. The Guru said that Baikanaya had truly learned to see God in all. Nako beri nahi bigana sagal sang humko banai. He saw no enemy, he saw no stranger, he was a friend to all. And it's this example of Baikanaya which inspires so many humanitarian initiatives led by Sikhs today. And I conclude my reflection with the powerful call in the encyclical to harness forgiveness and reconciliation. A verse in Sikh scripture states, Jaha lobh de kal hai, jaha khimmat de aap. Where there is greed, there is death and destruction, but where there is forgiveness, there is God himself. The passages on forgiveness in the encyclical reminded me of Pope Francis's book, The Name of God is Mercy, which contains so many meaningful expositions on what it means to forgive. Some of you may have heard of the Charter for Compassion, and I would also like to share that a peace charter for forgiveness and reconciliation exists, and which I'll chat the link to, and which was presented to Pope Francis a couple of years ago. The vision of the peace charter is that the process of forgiving is vital if healing and reconciliation are to take place as part of our collective efforts to seek justice, harmony, and sustainable peace. And I'll end with a few words from the Charter's preamble. Forgiveness is understood as an activity arising directly out of a compassionate consciousness, rooted in the awareness that we all belong to one human family. Compassion is an indispensable spiritual disposition in every faith, religion, dharam, or deen, as well as for our everyday human relations. Forgiveness is fostered by our experience of unconditional love and mercy and an inner calling to live magnanimously and responsibly. It stems from our ability to see a larger context to our individual and collective existence, and from our impulse to lovingly seek and forge genuine and sincere bonds with each other as brothers and sisters. Thank you.
Thank you, Pritpal Kaur, for your reflections, and I think moving reflections to hear that there are so many things that I think is always the fruit of a meeting like this. We remind one another of stories of goodness and people who have moved us in our lives, and hopefully that brings our hearts closer together. So thank you very much for sharing with us today. And our last speaker for this part of our sharing this morning, I'd like to introduce Reverend Kosen Gregory Snyder. And he's the Senior Director and Assistant Professor of Buddhist Studies at Union Theological Seminary, where he oversees the Master of Divinity degree program in Buddhism and Interreligious Engagement, as well as the Thich Nhat Hanh program for Engaged Buddhism. I'll turn it over to you, Greg, and mute so you don't hear the fire engines.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I very much enjoyed reading this encyclical and feel honored to be invited to comment on it. I too will be offering a perspective that comes from the Buddhist tradition rather than any kind of critical engagement. But I just want to begin. mostly I'll be referring from that perspective on this notion of the parable of the Good Samaritan. I want to, because it brings up certain questions that resonate with at least I'm speaking for myself specifically from the Zen Buddhist tradition and within a Mahayana tradition, which is certainly not the whole of the what we consider this tradition. And I'll just begin by saying that we pretty much agree on the idea that the basic human problem is that we carry a commitment, a deep commitment to separation of ourselves from one another and the world around us. In other words, there's something within the mind that is prone to grasping itself and creating the psychic foundations for a kind of separation that, if we're not careful, if we don't train in a particular way, that we can fall prey to that, and it can manifest. And in any moment in human history, that's a possibility. We're seeing that at this moment. And what came to mind when I was thinking about one articulation of our human life together is something that in the Avatamsaka Sutra is called Indra's net. I bring this up in part because it speaks to a way of talking about interconnectedness that's slightly different from a universal that can be understood as separate from a particular. In other words, this net, the Indra's net, is an infinite. For the Mahayana, this is a strong metaphor. This net is an infinite cosmic lattice of reflective jewels. But while each jewel holds a singular position in the universe, each surface of that jewel reflects the entire cosmos from that position. With varying proximity and intimacy, no movement in the universe occurs without every precious life being touched by it. Each life is then an irreplaceable particular, while also being a reflection of infinite being. Further, every jewel is mirrored in limitless other jewels, and so can never be reduced to a singular position. Add to this the Buddhist teaching that nothing has a permanent core or boundary, then set life into motion, and each jewel in itself is a lattice of reflectivity without bottom, swirling through all the other jewels. And so there isn't, in this way of considering the world, there isn't a universal, even if we're talking about universal love, there isn't a universal that can be found without being reflected in the particular, without being reflected from the location of a given being. And so, but our tendency is to see through the eyes of separation. I'm here, you're there. There's an interior, there's an exterior, which can leave us with a deep sense of lack. That there's a hardened outside with which we cannot be reconciled, one that we must manipulate for our own survival and benefit. And then from this, we fall into greed and hatred, pushing and pulling against that other side, living from a perspective of separation that leaves us with confused views, as we see often with our current economic system, with confused views about what brings us happiness, often involving trying to wrest the world into a permanent state of satisfaction. And from this confusion comes our selfishness and our violence and our aim to dominate people and animals, our Mother Earth, as we attempt to fashion reality in our image. And in this, where I think there's a resonance with Pope Francis here, is that we can't see the wisdom of selflessness in this position. We can't see that the wisdom of selflessness arises from this truth of our interpenetrating existence, that caring for the suffering stranger is caring for the world that is us. Love and compassion are not only good feelings or sensible moral orientations. And I want to say something about compassion here. Compassion comes from the word karuna, and the root karuna, kir, is active. It's an action. So compassion in translation from the Buddhist word karuna is better translated as compassionate activity or compassionate action. It's about doing something to relieve suffering, not simply feeling that suffering. And love and compassion are not only good feelings or sensible moral orientations, they are expressions of the ultimate truth of existence. Love is the heart's direct knowing of the interconnectedness of all life and compassion in turn is the drive to remove everything in the way of realizing this truth fully. So here the equation is kind of straightforward. To the degree that we align human society with this interconnected existence, human suffering decreases. To the degree that we act from separation, our misery increases at our peril. But this is not simply an intellectual endeavor. It is not the supplanting of our individuality with the universal. We must do the work of cultivation that frees the more permeable wisdom of our bodies and hearts from the mind's grasping of a separate, permanent self. And in some ways, the projection of a universal can be the projection of this separate, permanent self. So we have to be very careful what we mean by what we're looking at when we talk about universals. Before we have realized the wholeness of our shared existence, we must be diligent in training ourselves in compassionate and loving relationship, cultivating an understanding of views that is not defensive but additive, and embodying identities that are not dominating or exiling, but warm hand to warm hand. The Buddha always talked about upaya, or this skillful means in our relationships that changes based on context. And possibly like no other, we are in a time of reckoning. We must account for histories of violence in the way our choices, certainly my own tradition, our choices have conditioned our orientation toward one another. The teaching of karma asserts the intentions behind our actions plant seeds that come to fruition at some future moment. If we act from a perspective of separation and selfish intention, we will further separation, harm, and suffering. If we act from wholeness and a loving care for all beings, we will further wholeness, harmony, and liberation from suffering. So many people and peoples, our Mother Earth and her many beings have suffered enormous violence, leaving karmic seeds for which we must account. To heal, we have to make these histories present for ourselves and our communities. We must together cultivate the spiritual practices and wisdom necessary to assure they do not continue to come to unconscious fruition again and again. And I think this point of practice is very important because since the European Enlightenment, there's very much an idea that we can just simply know directly without the cultivation that's necessary for wisdom. And that cultivation maybe is something that needs to be more in the forefront. So I'll just say that each one we've passed, when we're talking about passing someone in the road, each one we've passed is nothing less than one of these jewels manifesting infinity, a path to our spiritual liberation and the ultimate truth of our own existence. Only love and compassionate action will allow us to realize the fullness of this life, allow humanity to realize the fullness of its life, and humanity to realize its place in the cosmos, and to say that it is very much about bringing forward and acting. The parable of Good Samaritan does not only ask us to care for the harmed along the road, it confronts us with the question, who are we? The story in my reading, disallows our spiritual pride. If we seat ourselves in Jesus' audience at that time, the robber is not up for discussion, and we are the passers-by, tasking us with the question, who are we, before all else? The question resonates deeply with the Buddhist tradition. Eihei Dogen, the 13th century Japanese Buddhist monk, asks us to take a backward step and illuminate the self as the first gesture of spiritual practice. The Buddha recognized it was the grasping of the content and structures of mind that leaves us with hardened views that lay the groundwork for ignorance, division, greed, hatred, and harm. Today, we seem to be lost in these views. Whether this is different from any other time is hard to say, but we are certainly fixed as absolute truths. We are fixed on them as absolute truths as if each of us are the architects and arbiters of reality. We seem most sure of our views regarding others, though we do not consider when asking the question, who are we? We instead leave them across the road as an eternal who are they, and a means of justifying our fear, greed, and pride. We're even led to believe by political and religious demagogues that if their views are extinguished, if they themselves are extinguished, a more perfect world will surely follow. So we live in a time, and again, maybe like other times, where there's a loyalty to orthodoxies that intimidate and exile those who disagree, and that this is held above embodied love and wisdom. And there is an outrage that scoffs at more porous hearts, and this is held up as a champion of moral truth. But this is an ethics of gangs and warlords, not those who wish for humanity to unfold this beloved community. Too many now believe that hatred of the abusers those who we feel abuse us will somehow unfold a path to a better world. However, as it reads in the Dhammapada, hatred is never appeased by hatred in the world, but non-hatred alone. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is, for Buddhists, is the Dharma eternal. So I'll just end by saying something about there was a phrase during the Riverside speech where Dr. King mentioned, love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. This for Buddhists seems to be true in the way that we understand the world. But this love is an opening up to a recognition that all of those in front of us, the person that is immediately before me, is an expression of it isn't that they are of the same eternity. They themselves are an expression of an eternity themselves. That when we're not recognizing, when we're coming from hardened loyalties to orthodoxy, to tribe, to the loudest person in the room, we will surely replant our violent karmic tendencies and create a road where most will be ignored, a road where safety hinges on those in power being one's political allies and protectors. But rather than this, to see that each of us are these jewels that are manifesting in infinity before us. We're each located in a tradition, an ancestry, a nation, a people, and histories of pain and joy, of unspeakable violence and unspoken intimacies. And each of us also reflect the whole of dynamic, timeless eternity. So I would suggest that maybe we need to walk more slowly among one another, that we stop, turn toward each other, and witness infinity in the jewel before us, always asking, who are we? Maybe only then will we be able to feel one another's suffering. Only then will we not be able to pass by. Only then will we have a chance of manifesting Fratelli Tutti, of cultivating a just society and a human future, finally able to fully receive the infinite gifts of this life. So those are my thoughts, some of them coming from the perspective of Mahayana Buddhism, and I very much appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. We very much appreciate sharing the time with you. And I think listening to everyone, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a heads up because people have the opportunity now, if they would like to chat in a question to Aaron, and he'll bounce it back to me. But also each one of our speakers today, we're asking you if you would like to follow up or have a question or a comment from something that you heard today from some of your colleagues as they've been presenting. And we'll have the opportunity also to go into small meeting rooms later and have some more conversation. I think a lot of us will be facilitators and be there. But one of the themes I keep hearing, and I hear, because I think a good friend of mine, Rabbi Jack Bemprod, who used to teach at the Angelicum, and he would teach Plato studies, he used to like to quote the Talmud to me saying, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. And as we're struggling to understand who we are in these types of encounters, I do think there's a great richness in what we're doing as we try to challenge ourselves to, as Pritpal Kaur said, to put it into exercising what we are doing. What are we exercising? What do we need to exercise is a good reflection. And the story of keeping people in poverty, as we've been trying to address, structures that keep people in poverty, where we even give them the name poor, but I believe it's good to call them people who live in poverty. They're not poor. We keep them there. As we struggle with our structures and what's going on in our world, and we make victims, which I think is one of the most horrible things that we do as people with one another, because once you've been through the trauma of being abused, it's a long road to overcome that. And as we're calling for, to have good violence fix bad violence, or good hatred fix bad hatred, leaves us only in this cycle of constant spinning and towards division. And so I strongly hear the call for reconciliation. It's something our community is dedicated to. So maybe in a selfish way, to say to all of us, what's next? What do we need to do next? More events like this, or It's a good beginning, but we believe that Fratelli Tutti was a call for us, at least Christians, to realize the challenges you are giving to us this day. Because in the story of the Good Samaritan, we're supposed to see ourselves in all the roles. I, as the priest who is indifferent, the worse than hatred, I'm indifferent to the person who is poor, who is living in poverty. I'm indifferent as the lawyer. I'm indifferent as the people that just walk by from things that it's just too easy to just say it's too hard to change. So just giving you all a moment to think, do any of the presenters, would you like to make a further comment? Okay, Rabbi Bert, take us away.
Thank you, and I especially want to thank my 3 colleagues on the panel for their truly enlightening perspectives and their well thought out presentations. It was enormously helpful. I live most of my life in New York City, where I have regular and delightful interaction with Cardinal Archbishop Timothy Dolan. Now, the reality is that on most political issues, Cardinal Dolan and I are on opposite ends of the argument. In fact, it might be we're on opposite ends of the argument on most things, except maybe sharing a good beer together. That said, Dolan said something to me that I'm now saying aloud to myself, but I think it speaks to the moment. He said that we have been doing dialogue since Vatican II, and it's finally about time that we got past dialogue of grievance. That's his phrase, the dialogue of grievance. And I have to say, mea culpa, I engaged a bit in that dialogue in my earlier statement. I was kvetching about what I didn't like. But Dolan then pointed to the fact that what we need to do, and we must continue dialogue because it is the first way we get to know one another, but we need to get beyond dialogue and work together. Any one of us on the call, not just the panelists, but all of the hundreds of people on the call, could list easily a half dozen things that need doing in our local parish, in our neighborhood, in our congregations, whether it's feeding the hungry or clothing the naked or housing those who have no place to stay, especially in this chilly winter, or indeed giving shelter to someone who's suffering from COVID-19 and has no place to go, or helping people get vaccinated, etc., etc. We must work together, all the religions, to serve humanity. That service is what we are called to. I think, as some of you said, that is indeed the message of the Good Samaritan. And on that score, I will happily embrace it. It's time for us to not only know one another, but to work together in service.
Thank you, Bert. Other comments? Mona, please.
I think that, Rabbi Bert, people are working together. That's the whole point. And people are coming together, whether they are humanitarian organizations or just civic organizations, but they're not necessarily saying that we're coming together as faith organizations. They just happen to belong to a faith organization. And I think that even with COVID, what we're seeing that there are so many people who've come together, but as part of civic society. And one of the problems with talking almost too much about religion and dialogue is that it tends to set religion apart from civic society. Religion is part of civic society. And so that if you are doing something to help, whatever faith or no faith you are, you're doing it as a citizen. You're not necessarily doing it because you want to say, I'm doing it because I'm Sikh or Muslim or Christian or whatever. I think it's absolutely fine to hold on to your faith when you're doing this. But we do tend to, I think, reduce the number of organizations that actually are coming together to help, but just don't talk about it in this kind of very obvious way. Even if you look at the vaccines rollouts, so many organizations, non-faith and faith, are just coming together seamlessly. And I think we should recognize that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. Anyone else? A question, a comment? Because if we don't have any more at this time, we'll be moving to the next phase of what we're set up to do. So I believe that as messages are coming in, all right, let's see, there is a question. Where does the dialogue begin when facts and truth are not recognized by either of those dialoguing? This is at the source of much, if not of all, the divisiveness in the US today. So once again, where does the dialogue begin when facts and truth are not recognized by either of those dialoguing? As we're struggling today in the United States about fake news and what is truth and where does truth come from, we struggle within our culture today. Do any of you have a comment on how do we begin dialogue when there is no sense of a common understanding of truth? Or even as we look at representations in journalism today, what is it? I think we're being killed by adjectives in journalism today, because some adjectives they put before people are quite amazing. But what do we do with that? How can we have dialogue when we question what is truth? Does someone want to comment on that?
Can I?
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I think that this is one of the reasons I'm quite reluctant to do dialogue, to be honest, is because we don't actually ever talk about issues that are really happening, even within our own faiths or across faiths, whether they're political issues or whether they are issues within religious faith communities. There's a tendency to present the best of yourself and look for the worst in others. And I think that is what makes dialogue meaningless. So why aren't we talking about things that are really happening around the world? Because we decide our own truths. We decide we want to talk about certain things. We overlook where people are getting oppressed now. This was the first time I heard, and it was lauded in the news that on Holocaust Memorial Day, people were talking about current genocides. It's not that they haven't talked about it before, but the news media made it a big thing. But talking about something and actually putting yourself, committing to doing something about it, are two very different things. And also acknowledging that there are lots of issues within your own faith communities, never mind faith, but the lived realities of your own faith that also need addressing. And I often find that people are very reluctant. I would quite happily talk about all the issues in Muslim communities. I have done for the best part of my academic career. But I think that unless we face up to those issues, rather than pitting one another against, well, this is happening in your community, not in mine, dialogue becomes kind of meaningless. It honestly becomes an exercise in optics only.
Totally agreed. Confession is good for the soul. Rabbi Bert?
I agree and disagree with Mona. I agree that dialogue can be meaningless. And I would like to distinguish among dialogue on one hand, debate on the other, and then finally diatribe. I have sometimes traveled halfway around the world thinking that I was going to a dialogue, only to find out that I was meant to listen to a diatribe. Or I've gone someplace with the best of intentions to present my point of view and then had it rebutted point by point. And that seems to me to be the kind of fruitless dialogue you're talking about, Mona. But I have also had opportunity to go where I am open and trust the dialogue partner well enough, usually it takes time to get there, where I'm open to be convinced of their point of view, not to convert me, but to engage me in a different point of view on something that we need to do together. I think you're quite right. Civic society does accomplish that. But I think that you overlook the hundreds of thousands of religious actors who are on the ground daily, feeding the hungry, caring for the poor. And that is a very powerful force that we need to harness together.
Just very briefly to that last point, Rabbi, but that's exactly my point, that there are hundreds of thousands of people of religious persuasion and faith that are working within civic society, that are not aside from civic society. why don't we just see that the whole of that as civic society, rather than take faith groups out specifically? They're doing it because that's the moral good of their faith. They're doing it because out of compassion and love, but they are part of that civic society. And that's my concern, that so often we almost separate what religious organizations are doing as if they're either on the periphery or they are exceptional. They should see themselves as part of the citizenship of that whole society. That's all I'm saying.
I agree. I want to embrace religions for peace, for instance, which Pritpal Kaur is representing. I think recognizes each religion, but acts within civil society. Of all things, even the United Nations has finally, and the World Bank as part of that, has finally come to the realization that though they are civic society organizations, they can harness religious organizations to work for the common good. And that is, of course, when all of us not only fulfill our religious obligations, but fulfill our obligations as citizens of the world. So on that score, we absolutely agree.
Thank you. And one of our participants would like to ask Greg a question, if that's possible, Greg. The question is, I'd love to hear Greg Snyder say a bit more about Buddhism critiques of universalism. One of my concerns about Fratelli Tutti is this sense that at some points in the text, that in order to be brothers, sisters, siblings, we need to find something that we all share in common, universally. Maybe Buddhism offers other ways to be interconnected without being the same. Do you have some thoughts on that, Greg?
Yeah, I would say that, to speak at the kind of big theological level, there is a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Dr. John Tatamano, often says that Buddhism doesn't have the great sky hook. In other words, there's not a cause outside of all the causality, inner causality. There's not a beginning primary cause. So in other words, everything is intercausal, everything's affecting each other, everything's touching each other. But there's not something that caused all that to happen. That simply goes to limitless, ancient time, and will go forward forever. So there is a way that we still are touching each other, affecting each other, that our actions are moral because they harm or do not harm. But it's not necessarily because there's a singular cause of all of that. So it isn't about discerning the singular set. I don't want to say the singular, well, in some ways, the singular set of truths. It's almost more like a physics of morality, you might say. So there is, because these things simply do, karmic behavior through intention creates particular outcomes, and we can see this somewhat consistently. And if we're paying attention to it, we can see how moral causality works. And so there is an attentiveness to what we do because it has particular effects. So when we're talking about that inner causality, in some ways it's infinite infinities. We are each of us a universe, and we are each in connection with each other in these ways. So to reduce any of us to a singular one that we're all a part of doesn't account for the vastness of every being in some ways. So that's one way of talking about it. It's not an easy thing to talk about. I think we would need to have a much longer conversation. But can I say one thing about the question that just came before, though? Would that be all right?
Sure, please.
Yeah, because I want to say something about this idea that we are not, that we have different realities or different truths. I don't think this has ever not been true. I don't think it's whether or not people are politicizing and weaponizing those different truths. And the fact that members of my family and myself have very different truths about the history of this country is no more different now than it was 15 years ago. That is consistent. However, we have a force in this country that is and media outlets and everything else that's gathering that all together and turning it into a force. And that's when we run into a real problem. So how do we meet each other? In some ways, the same way we've always met each other, which is to not to not meet a person from the fear of their ideas first, but in relationship to them as a human being. Now, their ideas may be dangerous, but their ideas are dangerous because there's a political force making their ideas dangerous. And that has to be called out and recognized. But when I'm dealing with an individual, which is the only thing that I ever meet, I don't meet the political force. In that sense, I'm a body with another body that has humanity and being, and I'm meeting that person as a human first. And then can we just recognize that, yes, we grasp our ideas. I grasp my views, they grasp their views. And how can we have a conversation and grasp our views just a little bit less so that we can actually connect with each other? So I would start with real bodies in the room, which in some way is what the Good Samaritan is asking. There's a body on the road. Stop thinking about who it is. Help.
Excellent. Thank you. Just a real quick question that we were kind of bouncing around. In general, for Fratelli Tutti, asking our panel members today, is there something that didn't get treated that perhaps could be added to what was said? Or what do you think is the obstacle then to next steps? Two different ways to look at via positiva, via negativa. Was there something that struck you that was missing there, like something needed to be said? Or is there an obstacle for us to moving forward that you feel needs to be the first thing we looked at? Would anyone like to comment on that or take a stab at it? Okay, Mona, please.
Unmute.
A bigger call to humankind and fraternity. But I don't understand what's the next step, because all of us are taking steps in our own ways, or some of us are. And I think the only thing that stops us from doing the right thing is our own egos, is our own sense of self-preservation, or our own sense of triumphalism, or our own sense of lack of compassion or reaching out. And I think for many of us, our moral life only happens when we meet someone else. You know, we cannot be moral within ourselves. So when we meet someone else, what is it that we want to share with that person? And it's not always help that somebody needs. Sometimes somebody needs a different kind of relationship. So we have to embody the spirit of not only compassion, but I would also say an empathetic citizenship, because all dialogue is local. There's no sense, I think, in making huge proclamations about abstracts, because abstracts don't translate into anything until we ourselves take action. So for me, I didn't see the word ego, I might have missed it, but I think that there are a lot of people who are hindered from doing something different, from taking risks to help because of the context in which they are, or because of something else that stops them. And I think it's courage that's needed. So I'm just thinking at the top of my head here, but it just seemed to me that in the end, you can only embody good things if you actually act on them, not just call people into action. Thank you.
Thank you. Bert?
I would certainly agree with Mona, but I think there are other impediments that keep us from acting. And one of them, especially these days, is simply being overwhelmed. There are so many things calling on us, calling on our time, and some of them seem so immense, whether it's the virus that has affected all of humanity, or whether it's racial justice or poverty. These things seem so endemic to society that we are crippled, we're frozen, and unable to act. My teacher, Ruth Messenger, often reminds me that we do not have the luxury of being overwhelmed, which is her nice way of saying right? Get to it. And I think you're right, Mona, that action is called for. And in the moment that we are overwhelmed, then we must pick one small thing that we think we can do and start there. And having done one, then we do the next. And then we invite someone to join us until we can address broader problems to the extent of our capability. But we don't have the luxury of being overwhelmed, frightening though it may be. Courage is right. You're absolutely right.
Thank you. Greg?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One, I agree with both of my colleagues here that the piece around service together and finding our way to do that and being engaged. Also, something of the earlier conversation, which is the courage to have the conversations that need to actually be had, that aren't just presenting our best selves. I think that is a real. I don't see that in most documents that come out. I don't see a real honesty about that when we get in a room together and have the conversations of the pain that's in our body that come from histories with relationship to one another, that there's not a great deal of skill, it seems, there, which is a little bit frustrating considering everyone's, oftentimes there's a whole lot of clergy in the room, so if we don't have the skills to do that, then we're missing something. We're really missing something. And little things show up. Like when I see usages of I still see the use of words like pagan as celebrated as being ended in the history of Europe. And there's not a discussion of what that meant for indigenous communities all through what we now call Europe. And that was a wiping out. And so there is there are just conversations that we haven't had and that are in people's bodies. And I don't want to have, I personally am not interested in having those conversations academically in terms of like, these are the histories and let's yell about the histories, but that these histories exist in us. They are in our bodies, and we have to speak to them from our bodies in ways that we can collectively hold them compassionately and to move them forward. I don't know that we have the skills to do that, but it is a next step, because I don't see moving forward without honestly recognizing and metabolizing our pasts. So.
Thank you. Yes, Pritpal, Kaur?
Yeah, I don't think this is specifically answering your question, but just to comment on the dialogue action piece of the conversation. And I think somebody's chatted in something to the effect of what I wanted to share. So I think there's a lot of interesting service-based models of interfaith learning and interfaith action out there. So instead of the dialogue leading to action, it's really action leading to dialogue. So, coming together with our shared values to achieve a common goal, and through that process, using that as an opportunity to then have those difficult discussions. And I think there's some really interesting and wonderful work being done around creating service-based learning and models of interfaith cooperation based on that. And I know organizations like the Interfaith Youth Corps are doing great work on university campuses, developing those kind of models academically, but also creating service-based opportunities as the starting point for that dialogue. So I just wanted to share that as well.
It's my great pleasure because, to have Father Brian McQueenie here representing the good ecumenical and interfaith work that the Archdiocese of New York has done for a very long time, and has been a partner in this, really closing us out, because as we know, like politics, so much of interreligious dialogue is local. And I think it's not a coincidence that the Holy Father asked for local religious leaders to come to his, event at the World Trade Center site. I think, Father, you know how this works itself out in the 5 boroughs. And so with that, I just think it's so fitting that you would be with us to close it out and to bring us back to earth, as it were. And how does this work out here in New York? So thank you.
Thank you very much for that very wonderful reflection. I don't know how long I have. I will try to be short, but for an Irishman, it's almost as difficult as it is for a Jewish rabbi. My friend Rabbi Potasnik and I always compete for the microphone. One of the things you brought up, Chloe, was the great opportunity to gather together with Pope Francis at 9/11's Memorial Museum. And one of the things that struck me was when he left. And it was inspirational because nobody left. Everybody was talking together. Everybody was sharing cards. Everyone was making plans to continue to talk on other days. And I think that spirit certainly came forth from the Holy Father himself, and that was an inspiration. I would say, and I have thoughts all over the place, I feel like I'm putting 20 pounds of thought inside a 5-pound sack. So excuse me if I'm not as organized as our wonderful panelists. But this is the best and the worst of times. I think of Fratelli Tutti as the latest step, the latest milestone of a history that unfortunately is not that long. It goes back, at least in my opinion, strongly to Vatican II and to that great document called The Church in a Modern World, in which the bishops in 1965 say, wait a minute, there is too much dehumanization. We're not respecting the gifts of creation. And that message was heard by some, but not by many. And then we have John Paul II in his encyclical on America. And he said specifically America because he wanted to recognize that in our hemisphere, there are those who are prosperous, who have all the gifts, and yet there are others from whom the gifts have been taken and no retribution, no restitution was given. And then we come to our dear Pope Francis, and there's many other steps along the way. In fact, when Bert was talking about, his problems with part of that thing, and I can see what he's saying. That's part of the bumps. We're still learning. We still have to learn the language of dialogue. But anyway, Pope Francis began our dialogue in this area, not with Fratelli Tutti, but with Laudatio Si. And he says that the earth is crying out, but in Fratelli Tutti, he says the poor are crying out. All of us have to be united in a concern for our human family. And Mona said so much of value that I would love to. I'm going to look forward to listening to the recordings. But Mona talked about the dialogue being local. But for the dialogue to be local, there's a couple of things that are necessary. Number one, and I said this in our little group, I feel that not only do we have to encourage dialogue in different religious traditions, we have to have dialogue in our own tradition. There are people in our church, our beautiful Catholic Church, who think that I'm a heretic. Why? Because I'm talking to those Muslims. Why? Because I'm not standing up and trying to make everybody Roman Catholic. They don't even recognize Eastern Catholics. That's a problem. Also, it's wonderful to have Fratelli Tutti, but is it going to be, and are we going to take advantage of our own skills and our own abilities to pass that message on to the man and woman in our churches, in our synagogues, in our mosques? I fear that too many of these statements remain in the abstract level. There's dialogue, yes, but only among the minority. The majority have to begin to sign on. One of the things that the pandemic has done for us, and again, people have brought this up, is the fact that we have working together. Oh, there's a crisis. Let's work together. But why do we only work together with a crisis? With Katrina, with Sandy, with the pandemic. We have got to have a much wider vision. And that comes to our problem as clergy, and particularly the heads of our different congregations, our different churches, whether they're presidents of communities or bishops or cardinals, whatever. The people have to be inspired by their leaders to move forth and to engage in one another. Sometimes it's going to be little, but the dialogue that the Holy Father Benedict talked about at times, and John Paul, was the dialogue of action, the dialogue of fraternity. The dialogue of theology only gets you so far. Now, one of the things that was said is that passion is not enough. And I agree with that 100%. But on the other hand, if we don't have passion in our effort to educate our communities, then we're never going to get ahead. This is a task that has to involve not only the intellect, but the will and the desire for one another and for each other's progress. One of the things that I have felt gifted on in the last couple of years is our dialogue with the Buddhist community. And we got to the point of friendship where we took a trip to Taiwan, and we got back literally just before COVID. But in that trip to Taiwan, we learned so much about each other's traditions. But I thought I saw a lack in my own tradition. And that dialogue inspired me theologically to become a better Catholic. That is not understood, I think, by people who oppose dialogue and who don't see what the Pope sees. The Pope is bringing out a reality that has been always there. He is not a rebel from the Catholic tradition. He is not doing anything different, but taking out of the storehouse, in the words of the scripture, what is old and yet what can be and must be renewed. So it's important for us to recognize that we are in the best of times, but also we're confronting the worst of crises. And unless we share our knowledge, unless we educate our young people, particularly our young people, in the Roman Catholic Church, and I don't know, Brian, you're the general of a community, whether or not the younger priests and the younger religious have the same appreciation of how far we have come and how we must not go backwards. And that is my concern, that sometimes crisis brings out the worst in people. And I would hope, and I learned so much today, and I will go over the contributions of each of our panelists because they fed us richly.
Thank you, Father McWeeny. It was so good to hear from you. I'm so happy you could come and be at the table today with us. What you said is surely affirming for all of us. I just want to add that, well, we are trying, like everyone else, to deal with vocational crises times, but our younger guys in formation truly do try to carry the torch of ecumenism and interfaith dialogue. The webinar now is coming to a conclusion. Again, I just want to thank the panelists. You are all so brilliant and so kind to give us the time in the different time zones in which you live to be part of this. And so we really do appreciate that. Again, on behalf of Graymoor Ecumenical and Interreligious Institute, which is a ministry of the Franciscan Friars of the Atonement, I want to thank our Minister General, Brian Terry, for moderating the discussion. I also want to thank our co-sponsors. Again, the Interfaith Center of New York, the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue, Religions for Peace USA, and the Thich Nhat Hanh Program for Engaged Buddhism for being part of the network that put this together as well. And special thanks to Aaron Hollander, who is Associate Director of Graymoor Ecumenical and Interreligious Institute, for all the tech work for today's program and the assistance that he got as well from Jonathan Host. So thank you. And please stay tuned into our various websites for future programming. We realize that this is not as good as getting together. We know that. But COVID has given us one blessing, and that's we're all getting used to Zoom. And so we're able to produce programming. And so please just check out the website geii.org and see what comes up next. Thank you again. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.